I'd like to now present you with the bio of Dr. Nancy Nelson. Dr. Nelson is an award-winning educator with over 30 years in the Canadian post-secondary education system. Currently the Director of Teaching Innovation at Conestoga. She's an engineer focused on AI in education, STEM, educator development, and educational technology. Nancy has been awarded Engineer Canada's Medal for Distinction in Engineering Education, Colleges and Institutes Canada's Leadership Excellence Award for faculty, and most recently, a 3M National Teaching Fellowship by the Society of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nancy to join us for her talk. Thank you.
Can I stop this? Yeah. Let's just get it started. Oh, it's not a touchscreen. I am so used to a touchscreen. I keep trying to touch Mona's computer to make it work. I'm happy to be here this morning, and thank you for coming. And for those of you that are here in person, thank you for coming on such a rainy day. On November 30th, 2022, the world changed, at least from my perspective. That's the date that ChatGPT was released to the public. And as Mona said, I'm an engineer by profession, and my research areas have been in AI. So I've been doing AI my full working career. So my master's degree, I wrote an intelligent tutoring system for students, got pushback from my peers saying, well, that's really nice as long as it doesn't interfere with the way I do my job. And then I taught in an electronics program, and I taught my students how to program expert systems. That was the AI of the day. They had fun. They created things to do all kinds of decision-based processes. And then in the last few years, I went back to school, did my PhD, and created an intelligent professional learning system for educators. One of the reasons I did that is because, as many of you know, that we have colleagues who are very reluctant to tap into evidence-based teaching practices. And they're still teaching the way people were being taught in 1950. Certainly the way I was taught when I was at school is not the way I teach now. And part of my goal was, in STEM in particular, we seem to be the most reluctant to change. So AI has been part of my life. But on November 30th, a couple of years ago, that changed because all of a sudden it wasn't where I wanted it and how I wanted it. It was out there for everybody, including my students. And students, I think, sometimes think we as faculty don't know what's going on. And so I had moved into teaching and learning from the electronic systems engineering program I had been teaching in. And I was asked last minute to step in and teach a first-year programming course. And I thought, and I'd been teaching that forever. And I thought, yes, I would like to teach that, but I also thought, no, I don't want to teach that because AI is here now. And everything I had my students do before, in the snap of a finger, they could have the responses to that. And so it put me in the position of being, this is really neat stuff. Look at the opportunities we have with ChatGPT being here. And oh no, I have to change what I've been doing as a teacher. I have to really rethink how I get my students to think about what they're learning and what they're doing. Because my core value is learning comes first. It's not about me as the teacher, it's about them as the student. And so I rejigged the course. I had to change the assessments. I had to change it to know whether my students were actually learning or not. So that's kind of my background in this. And then over the last year and a half, it's been my responsibility in the teaching and learning department to look at how we can bring AI into the classroom in a positive way, recognize the risks, but also be forward thinking and say, what do we need to do in order to make this work? It's not going to go away. And a lot of people think that that date back in November 2022 AI was here and all of a sudden, but we've had websites with chatbots on the bottom to help us find information. We've had Siri and we've had Alexis to answer our questions or play some music for us. We've had Netflix that tells us tonight we should watch this movie because we'd really like it. So it's been there, but it's been in the background. But for us as educators, it's right in front of our faces now. Works better if you turn it on. So in terms of the education world, we've had lots of disruptions, and I've been here, I would say, for most of them, either as a student or as a professional. The first was when the calculator came along, and I was still a student at that point, and I remember my profs going, "We can't let you use that. That's too easy. You're not going to have to think anymore." And I remember them telling us, "Well, we'll give you log paper, and if you can't figure out, if your calculator stops working, you can use the log paper." And we all kind of looked at each other and said, "What? So we can flip it over and use the backside to do it longhand in writing?" But it was there. And then as I moved into the education realm, the internet and the web showed up. And again, it was, oh no, the answers are all going to be there for the students. What are we going to do? How do we do this? And then last year, generative AI showing up. So the other two, I would say, for me as a student, it was a slight disruption. For me, it was great because I didn't have to do everything longhand anymore. The web, we thought about it as educators and said, well, we can make this work. We can say you can use it for this, you can't use it for that. Gen AI, to me, is the biggest disruptor we've had I've been here 40 years almost now, and the biggest in all of that time. But it doesn't mean we can't tap into it. We can't use it to help do what we do. So when I first developed this talk, I called it From Threat to Tool. But so much has changed in the last even 6 months with regard to AI, generative AI in particular, that to me it's now from threat to thought. We need to think of it not as this storm coming in, but as something that we as intelligent, well-educated people can use to help support us in our job. I like to use the terms effective, efficient, and ethical when I'm thinking about generative AI. But how do we do that and also instill in our students that this is a tool, this is something we can use, and we can use it in multiple ways, but we have to have that foundation knowledge before we can get to that point. When we're talking about educational systems, the researchers like to talk about 3 levels. They like to talk about the macro level. So this would be the institutions, this would be the governments, and governing bodies for those of us in programs that have those. These are the way you should be making your decision based on the current knowledge, based on the current state of affairs. Then there's the meso level, and this to me is where the real stuff happens. This is the classroom. So this is you, your students, the curriculum, and the resources you have to support that learning. And then the micro level are the players. So that's you. What are your beliefs? What are your behaviors? What are your actions? And your students, the same thing. They're coming into that space with their own experiences, their own expectations, their own behaviors. How do we make all of that fit together? What I want to do today is to use this to sort of frame our discussion. In particular, I want to tap into the macro piece. I want to think about if we take the guidance that's coming from around the world in terms of the researchers, the educators, how all of that is coming together to help frame the way we think about AI this morning. So I'm going to treat that as an acronym. We're going to go through each of the letters in macro, starting with the M. So at this point, I want you to think about managing your mindset. If we don't know where we're going or what we're intending to do, it's very difficult to do it. If we think about, we all have heard about growth versus fixed mindset and how our mind can influence the way we behave. So what I would like you to encourage you to do is this morning and moving forward is to switch toward that growth mindset. Think about the opportunities. I like to think about it in terms of balance, and that balance between being really optimistic about the opportunities and being really cautious about the risks. And so I go back and forth between being curious and being cautious in everything I do related to AI. And I would ask you to think about that as well. Now, some of you might remember this. 22 years ago, Donald Rumsfeld we all stood back and go, what? What is he saying? There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That's to say there are things we now know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. And we're all, this was on the news everywhere. And we're all going, what? What's he talking about? This is actually based on a framework called the Johari network that was designed to help identify complex psychological challenges for folks. Business leaders really quickly picked up on it as a way to look at a complex situation and make some sense of it. And it started to make sense for me when I saw this post. It was actually a tweet by Ethan Mullock, who's one of the most prolific writers about AI in post-secondary. He's out of the University of Pennsylvania. And he presented it this way. And if we think about it and we go upwards, things we know, we know. Those are the facts. So we step back and we say, what do we know about AI in education and in math education in particular? Well, we know how generative AI works, at least some of us do. We know that it can really quickly produce a believable summary. I put believable there because it's not always right. We know there are gaps. We know there are errors. We know there's misrepresentation because what it's based on the average of averages. We know a lot of this information has been scraped from the web, which means there is a lot of evidenced, good, solid work out there. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of errors. There's a lot of misrepresentation. There's a lot of bias. How do we deal with that when things are coming back? You and I, with our background, with our expertise and our discipline, can look at something and go, that's close, but not quite. And you're going to say, oh, there's a gap there. There's a really piece of important information that's missing from there. Or that part's right. This is just wrong. We also can look at the sources and look at that and say, I get a reference to a paper and that paper does not exist. Because of the predictive nature of generative AI, it says, okay, who's a good writer or someone who writes a lot about that area? And what journal do they usually publish in? And how many papers or how many people are usually on a paper for that journal? So it's, oh, there's 3 people. If it was me, then maybe it's one of my colleagues that I often will write with. And so it puts together pieces individually that are valid, but when they're put together, it looks great, but it's not real. We have the ability to discern that. Our students haven't learned that yet. They're still, we talk about basic employability skills for students, they're still working on that. We also know that out there are lots of AI-based math apps. So Khan Academies, I forget what it's called right now, is probably the biggest and probably the most successful, but they're still struggling because AI does not do math well. So if you ask generative AI what we in education should know about generative AI, LLM stands for large language model, if you're not familiar with the term. That's what the underlying layer of generative AI is. It's a neural network, basically, with connections between related things. But it can come back and very quickly say, we can use AI to support learning, but there are also potential threats. So let's quickly look at those. Personalized learning. This is a perfect place for students. They're sitting in my class today. I was teaching a fairly complex concept, and they're kind of going, I really don't get this. They can now go home and say, I'm a real sports fan. Tell me what that concept means related to sports. Give me an example. They can do that, and all of a sudden they go, oh, okay, now I get it. Why not tap into things like that? It can help those students for whom English is not their first language to understand what we've been saying. So they can have that going and say, oh, okay, this is how I would read it in my native language. Being able to interpret what we're saying and interpret the meaning of that. We can talk to it. So I no longer have to talk with my fingers. I can talk to AI and it will answer me back if that's a preferred way for me. It can very quickly generate content and curate things. I like to use it as a springboard right now, where I used to go to Google and spend a couple of hours pulling together resources. Now I say, find this. I check out the sources link to the papers, and I find the information. So all of a sudden, my job is a lot more efficient. Question answering, and I would question the problem solving piece. The question answering, I full-heartedly agree with. The problem solving, that's where the challenges is, and that's why it struggles with math. The potential threats, not thoughts. Low skill tasks. Are we going to offload those to that? So some people are worried about their jobs because of that. The bias, a really big thing. We need to pay attention. If I ask for example, it to generate a picture of a professor, it's probably going to generate a white male. If I ask it to generate a picture of a teacher, it's probably going to generate a white female. And I apologize to those of you that don't fit into those categories, but that's the information that it's based on. We've all heard about Google and their HR system that was completely biased for white males because that's who a lot of their programmers were. And anyone else who didn't fit that was filtered out before they even got to that process. So we need to be really aware of that. Reduced emphasis on critical thinking. This is particularly important in education because that's what helps establish that solid foundation upon which we build. The ethical concerns. For us, academic integrity. First and foremost, a lot of people are spending their worlds right now trying to catch students cheat. That to me is not the right approach, but a lot of people are caught in that. I've always done it this way. This is the way I've been told to test. You've got a course with multiple sections. Everybody has to assess the same way. So there are challenges there. But there's also the climate challenges. A very, very big footprint, even far more significant as compared to us getting in a plane and flying across the country to using generative AI every day. And the labor issue. A lot of people in other countries are being paid very poorly, if at all, to train these systems. And we need to think of that. So globally, those are challenges associated with it. So we have challenges at the global level. We have challenges at the government levels. We have challenges institutionally. We have challenges in the classroom. And then this one's really interesting too. And this is happening more and more, we're finding. On the tail end of COVID, we get this tool, which means I don't have to talk to anybody anymore. I can get my answers here. And so they're starting to see people retreating into their homes. So let's go to math now. And I have a colleague who is a real logic puzzle fan. I would guess a good part of every weekend is spent solving logic problems. And his perfect example of how AI messes up is with logic puzzles. So he solves it using the chart, the standard charts. And then he says to whatever AI platform he's using, what's the answer to this puzzle? And it gets the answer every time. But then he says, show me the steps. And he maps those steps onto the same grid. And those steps are full of holes. So there's something here that was critical to that decision that it's not able to do. It didn't perceive that, but it has the answer, probably because somebody posted the answer to that puzzle on the web somewhere else. And so it's very good at doing that and giving this. He showed me the responses for one of them, and it seemed very logical. And if you just read it, you might not see those gaps. But that's where the expertise comes in. That's where the development of that ability is really important. It might be because math itself has so many categories and ways of solving problems that I'm not sure whether you've seen this cycle before. But these are the kinds of problems that math people deal with every day. And what happens is each of them have a different process for solving, for finding the solution. What happens to generative AI? It gets caught in that confusion piece in the middle. It can't figure out what to do, so it takes a little from here, a little from there, a little from here, because they're all connected on the web in its neural network underneath. So that to me kind of put it in perspective as to why it might struggle so much with math. That leads us to our questions. And so the things we know that we don't know. And so for you, that one of those questions might be, I don't really understand how large language models work. I think for me to move forward, I should learn a bit about that. So you know that you don't know something. But there are lots of questions your colleagues may ask of you. What I'm going to do for you right now is to have you take 2 minutes. And if you're at home, you can use this and just jot down some questions you might have about AI as you know it right now. But here I would like you to talk to your neighbor and come up with a couple of questions that if I don't answer them in the next little bit, you'll have a chance to ask at the end. And so I'm going to put a timer on. You'll see this line at the bottom gradually disappear. When it gets to the end, our time is up. Okay, everyone, if I can have your attention back, please. So hang on to those questions. We'll come back to them at the end. The next thing, things we don't know, we know. And this to me is where, as teachers, we have a real strength. Because being in the classroom, we are constantly learning. Every day is a new experience. Every class is a different experience. And we learn from that. So to me, one of our superpowers is that ability to be constantly learning, to be constantly aware of what's happening in our space, what's going well, what's not going well. This image was generated from AI by Midjourney. But some of the things that we ourselves do is we know how to engage students, or at least I hope we do. We know how to make sure students see value in what we're doing in the classroom. If they don't see value, they're not going to come to class. Or if they physically come, they're going to be somewhere else in their mind. And probably the most important is that sense of care that we can establish, that sense of trust and care. A new paper came out last week, this week, maybe earlier, talking about the erosion of trust in higher education because of generative AI. So teachers are saying, I think you're going to cheat and I'm going to watch for you to cheat. Instead of saying, I trust you to make some wise decisions. Here's how I would recommend you use it. Here's how you're not allowed to use it. So never forget about what we know as teachers to help with this challenge. That takes us to the last of our 4 things here, the things we don't know that we don't know. And this is where that curiosity needs to come in. We need to be prepared to explore, to start thinking about what it is that we can do with this. And in math in particular, because it's so challenging for generative AI, there is now a $10 million challenge out there from the International Math Olympiad. So if you happen to be Gen AI, you can do this and want to develop a system, go for it, because there's lots of money out there. So this was announced in November, the end of November, just before ChatGPT came, or sorry, this past year. In January, a team from Google DeepThink came up with and was able to do 25 of the 30 questions in the allotted time. That's considered a gold winning award, which was what the challenge was. They haven't given any money to this team, but in July at the actual Olympiad, they'll be talking about progress and they'll be announcing what's out there. So if you're interested in that, aimoprize.com, you can find more information about that. The $10 million doesn't go to one person or group, it's distributed across many applications. So, but it shows the challenge that we have when we're dealing with mathematics. So that takes us now to the A in our macro acronym. And here's where we need to be able to adapt and adapt authentically. And that to me is the most important piece. How can we take what we know, what we've been doing, and say, how do I make it more authentic? Because with authenticity comes the value. Generative AI looks backwards. It's really good at what we already know, or at least it's mediocre at what we already know. What we need to, what it gets scraped is kind of gives us a hint as to why generative AI appears really good to students, because it's formulaic. There's a lot of stuff out there that says how to do things step by step. It's standardized. So there's a process for this. It's out there, probably multiple forms. And it's codified. We've got so many how-to videos, how to do this, how to do that. That's what it's trained on. So when a student says, how do I solve this problem? It can get the answer, not necessarily the steps in between. So we need to say, how do we tap into those steps? How do we tap into the process of learning? How do we get them to say, it's important to not go from here to here, but to be able to defend the choices they've made along the way in between. So I really like this work came out of Australia. And it's a different way of thinking about AI, because we get stuck thinking about it as that tool, that calculator, the equivalent of a calculator. The paper is actually called "It's Not Like a Calculator." Along the x-axis, we have an individual, so that might be me as a user of generative AI, to the far right, where I'm collaborating with generative AI. On the y-axis, we have offloading a task to extending a task. So if we think in the bottom left hand, this would be like the calculator. I can't remember what the capital of Canada is. I should, but if I didn't for some reason remember, I could very quickly go to AI. It's probably going to be right for something like that. So a simple task, I don't remember it. We had an expression in our house, no question goes unanswered. That was before Gen AI, it's even faster now. So cognitive offloading. The next is allowing generative AI to do something that I could do as a person, but it's making it more efficient for me to do. So this might be, in that case, me creating that image of the superpowers of a teacher. I probably could have done that. It would have looked really ugly because I can't draw, but I could have done it. So that would be what the extended mind is. Then as we move into the more collaborative pieces, this to me is where we've got the power, we've got the possibilities in education to be able to say, I don't know a whole lot about this. I saw something the other day called mimemic analysis. I'd never heard of it. So I went to Copilot and I said, what is it? Tell me what it is. Give me a quick summary. And Copilot provides sources. So it linked me to some posts, which linked me to some research. And I was able to figure out what that was. And then I said, how could I use this in the classroom? And it can then has somebody else written about that? Maybe if it finds it, it can put it together. So that's working with it as a resource. And then the top, which is a real potential for us in post-secondary education, is hybrid learning. Using it, and this is an Ethan Mollick term, best available collaborator. So I don't know about you, but there are nights where I wake up at 3 o'clock and I've got this idea in my head and my husband really doesn't appreciate it if I go, hey, what do you think about this? I can get up and I can go and say, what do you think the arguments against this would be? Or what's some research that I could find to support this thinking? And it will come back and give me that, and I can use that as a springboard. My students, I can say, if you didn't understand today, or you're not feeling particularly creative, that assignment I talked about at the beginning, I ended up having my students create a retro text-based adventure game. They had to pick their own genre. They had to pick their own story. And my engineering students sometimes say, well, I'm not very creative. And I think engineers are always creative, just in different ways. But if you can't think of a story, it's okay to go to generative AI. Say, this is the area I want it. Help me create a story, and ask for 5 offerings and pick one. But tell me you did that. Tell me what your prompt was. Tell me how you did that. That to me is the real power of this. We can help people help themselves. The competencies. Every discussion I think I've had with folks over the last year and a half has come back to competencies. What are those basic things that my students need to know in order to be a professional? And you can fill in whatever program you're teaching in. What do they need to know? How do I make sure they still know that before they turn to a tool like generative AI? And we talk about layers of abstraction. We talk about what are those critical thinking skills they need. So that conversation can go in many directions, but it's a really, really powerful conversation to have. And if we look at some of those competencies for math, and math probably has the most competencies because it is such a complex area. We have to be able to solve problems. We have to be able to reason logically. We have to be able to analyze things, to evaluate what comes back. Is it right? Is it wrong? We do need creativity to sometimes move beyond what we're thinking right now. While we have to be creative, we also need to be accurate and precise. We need to be able to share our ideas with other people. We have to think about how we're doing things, that metacognition piece. And we need that curiosity and inquisitiveness in order to keep growing in our areas. This is no small feat to accomplish all of those things. We have those. What we don't have right now is that AI literacy piece, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. How do we make sure that we know enough about how the tool works that we can ensure that this is still happening in our classroom? Learning is what it's all about. In order to learn, students need to be able to not only internalize the content of what we're teaching, but be able to take this and internalize, if they do go to a generative AI tool, what all of these things mean in that context. They need to be able to assess their own work. They need to be able to assess the quality of what's coming out of a tool like generative AI. But this is why math is tough for generative AI, because all of those things come together and are integrated into a solution. That takes us to our R. And here we can't talk about generative AI without talking about the risk. And we need to approach that risk responsibly. The three biggest risks right now: privacy and data protection, privacy of our own conversations with generative AI. What is it doing? What is it tracking? How is it using that information? And in terms of our institutions, if we're using an unprotected version of something, is institutional intellectual property being uploaded by people saying, oh, create some outcomes for me for this course description. And somebody uploads a whole program design, and then all of a sudden everybody in Canada has access to that program design because of one person doing that. The inputs and the outputs. The input to the model itself, was it trained on accurate, verifiable data? If it's web scraped, it hasn't been. Is that information up to date? So what's the quality of what it's basing its answers on? And then the output itself. We're the ones that need to vet that information. We need to take that into account as we're working forward. New cybersecurity risks. I'm sure the folks in our cybersecurity area here are pulling their hair out because every day it's something different. The hackers find various ways of getting into models, corrupting the data, biasing them, destroying them. It's a challenge, I think, for I think they're called the black hat hackers. I can't say that. But we need to think about that as well as we move forward. And then the O, the last of our framing thoughts, being able to optimize the opportunities that we have with generative AI. How do we take those? I talked about the curious and cautious. How do we focus on that curious piece? And this is where I want to talk about the AI literacy framework, because it's really important. This is a time and place where we're at the same levels as our students in terms of AI literacy. We're all learning this together. There's a small pocket of people that have been using AI for a long time, but most of us never acquired these skills as part of our teaching or as part of our learning. So how do we do that and also learn it ourselves, but also instill it in our students? I like this framework because it aligns with education. So those of you familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, these are going to align with the cognitive domain levels. The first thing we need to do is to know enough about generative AI in order to use it effectively. That might mean understanding what happens underneath for somebody like me that's an engineer and interested in that kind of thing. But that also might mean, how do I prompt it properly in order to get the kind of output that I want? So it depends on what you're trying to do and accomplish, what know and understand might mean to you. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be the same for all of us. But we have to know how to use it effective, efficiently, and ethical. That to me would be the baseline. The next level is to use and apply it. And this is, I like to call this tinkering or experimenting or playing with it. Go back to being a 3-year-old again and see what happens if you do this. Like if any of you have young children and you watch them learn, it's an amazing experience. Do that yourself. Play with this. Find out if this works, or that kind of a conversation works better than that kind of a conversation. Read about it. But you have to practice. This is one that you learn by doing. The next is to evaluate and create both with and within it. And that's getting up onto that right-hand side of that quadrant I showed you before. We're into the helping us learn, or we're into helping build things that we can help our students learn. We need to be careful of the evaluate piece though, because there's a lot of stuff out there right now talking about, well, yes, you can just upload your student work and upload your rubric and have it grade. That is uploading someone else's intellectual property. And if you read the terms and services that you agree to, it says you will not upload the intellectual property of anyone else. That includes our students. So unless you have their express permission to do that, you shouldn't be doing it. If you are doing it, go back to that ethical piece I was talking about. You can have your students do that check themselves though and submit that as part of an assignment. Then they're making the decision to upload it, but they have the right to say no. The ethics is the overarching to this literacy framework. What do you need to do? and learn what do you need to help your students learn. My advice to you would be to model. If you want your students to be transparent with you, tell your students that you use this to help create this case study, or you use this to generate some of the questions that are part of this test. And you'll notice as we went through, there were notes I had adapted from, modified from. I will often say done in collaboration with, and I'll put the date, the version of the generative AI tool I used, but acknowledge it, because that's where that trust piece is coming back that I talked about before. Students are saying, well, I can tell you're using it because you didn't used to be able to do stuff like this, and now you're doing this. So think about pieces like that. So that brings us back to our acronym for today, macro, that overarching thinking. So manage your mindset, adapt authentically, consider the competencies that are associated with what you're expecting of your students and yourself. Be responsible in the amount of risk you take and optimize the opportunities. I want to leave you with a closing thought. And this to me is one of the best quotes I've found about AI, particularly in education. I don't think it was intended for education, but it certainly fits. AI is at its best when working with human experts, helping them save effort. That's us. We can use it quite effectively and efficiently because we have that basic knowledge. The second part applies more to our students, but by outsourcing basic tasks to AI, we undermine the ability to create future experts because expertise is built from basic knowledge. Our job as educators is to help build that foundation. How do we do that? How do we determine when there's a place for generative AI? And how do we balance that caution and that curiosity? So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Sure.
Are there any questions from the audience?
It's Saturday morning. We'd also have questions from the folks who are at home as well, if you want to put them in the chat. We've got folks monitoring the chat.
What's generative about the generative AI?
That's a good question. And, I've never asked that question. And that's something I would probably ask Gen AI. My guess is that its ability to seek through that neural network that it has and be able to determine the best links based on the information in the prompt and how it has potentially answered questions like that before to be able to, but I'm just guessing. Oh, there we go. We've got an answer. Thank you.
In Conestoga College, a student can use that Grammarly because it's not generating anything for them. But there is a Grammarly Pro or something that I don't remember the name that actually generates something. That is create something that doesn't belong to the student, it's belong to the AI. So I think that's why we call it generative AI, because it's create something and then copyright, other things can happen from that.
And that's that pulling together of information based on what it does know. So that makes sense.
Create something, that's what I think.
See, but that's one of those questions that we have. Yeah, if I have the answer, I'll share it. If not, I'm quite willing to say, I don't know, I'll have to find out. Any other questions?
One from witness says, how do you see educators' best use of general AI in the mathematics classroom?
To me, I would, and I'm speaking through the lens of using math in engineering related subjects. So we're very closely knit. To me, I would go about it in layers. And I would say, what are the fundamental things that my students need to do? And I would expect them to be able to do that before they could then offload that task to a calculator or to a tool like generative AI. And so maybe it's basic arithmetic. If you can't do that and see it in your head and understand how that layer of abstraction works, then I don't want you to use that calculator yet. So I used to have a competition with my kids when we went grocery shopping, that who could get the closest to the amount that the bill was going to be. And so they got that ability to kind of another layer, to be able to not only take the numbers and put them together, but to be able to then estimate things and know what made sense and what didn't make sense. And so I would be looking at those layers of abstraction as we go from what we would consider to be very fundamental skills in math, moving upward toward the complex, the areas of math that I admire that all of you are able to do, that just kind of went past my head, and I got the functional. I got enough of it that I could do what I needed to do. I would want to make sure that I watched my students grow and was able to, in my mind, check off, yes, they can do that. Yes, they can do that. Now it's okay to use this tool. And so I would be reluctant, and I would discourage my students from using it initially, instilling in them the importance of learning and understanding before moving up. So I hope that answered Whitney's question.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from Brian Forrest. How likely is it that in 5 years, many of the issues with AI and mathematics will be overcome?
Sorry, I was just reading Ryan's message from there. I think a lot of progress is going to be made in 5 years, but that's the big question. So the pace is very, very fast right now, and there's a lot of effort going into that math Olympiad is an example. They're encouraging people to try to solve that problem. Will they solve it? I don't know. There are so many complexities to math in particular. Like for me, in engineering, where we use math, the thinking of the steps along the way are important. The mathematics itself, we need to understand why we should be using this or this, but not necessarily going through all the stages. So getting from, I need to use this particular process to solve this type of problem, generative AI can do that very easily because I need the answer at the end. And I think in math, though, where you're expecting that abstractness, that ability to pull those concepts together, it's going to be more, I think it's still going to remain the most challenging. That's just a guess. I think it's going to take a while for this one. I think you've got the biggest challenge of all of us.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is a little bit cynical, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. When I was studying, then when I became a teacher, and now as a professor, I've always heard people talking about technology in relation to mathematics and science. But now with generative artificial intelligence, ever since at least 1 year ago, when we finally came back in person at the University of Toronto, I see my colleagues in the humanities and literacy subjects more concerned than people in mathematics and science, especially because I'm at OISE in the Faculty of Education. Do you agree with this notion that Gen AI is perhaps more controversial in the humanities and social sciences than in science and mathematics?
I fully understand what you're saying. I get the opportunity now because of the role I'm in to talk to people interdisciplinary. And it's interesting how, as you say, and that graph I had at the beginning, we all went through the calculator, the internet, the thing, and we've dealt with these disruptions or things that impact the way we teach things in STEM areas. They haven't had to deal with that so much. They had Grammarly, which would correct the spelling and grammar. But this is a tool that can write, and it can write more eloquently than we can in many cases. What I like to think about it, and so yes, I think there is a lot more concern, but I think it's because we've been through some of these things already. But I think from their perspective, they're seeing an erosion of what they value, the same way as we went through when the calculator showed up, that those underlying principles. But I think there's also generative AI can write for us. It can create, I'll put air quotes around that, create things for us, but it can't really speak for us. And that to me is the difference. So yes, it could write the perfect essay. And it could write an essay and then I could take it and I could tweak it. And that's what's happening now with students in writing. They're just processing it a little bit so it doesn't appear to be Gen AI. There's always a way. And so to me, it's being able to convince their students that writing is still important, that writing is a way that we can connect what we've learned with how we want to communicate that to other people. And so to me, it always comes back to value. To me, the three areas are math, writing, and coding, because they're the fundamental skills for so many disciplines. And if we can instill in our students the need to tap into or to understand and appreciate the value of having that at your fingertips, then they will be able to write. And maybe they write the first draft with their ideas, and maybe it's not beautiful. Then you get it to pretty it up for the audience you want. I know for me, it's made my life of writing descriptions for workshops or things. I put my basic ideas down. These are the things I want to cover. And it comes up with something that would probably take me an hour to do, and it does it in 30 seconds. And then I tweak it. Then I say, oh, no, that wasn't right. That's, I think, what we need to do and what our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences need to be thinking about. So yeah, I have a bit of that cynic. That's in that, my balance every day. What am I thinking today? Is this
I think we have time for two more questions, maybe.
Hi, I teach math and computers at Ridge in Oakville, and there's a famous quote probably attributed to Isaac Asimov, and I'm sure most of us know Isaac Asimov and his 3 laws of robotics, but he came up with this quote: any teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be replaced by a computer. And I actually have that posted in my computer engineering classroom, because I truly believe that. If you as a teacher can be replaced by a computer, you should be. And I say that to my colleagues, and I'm not that popular.
But it's true. And this happened in COVID too. And people were saying, my students aren't coming to class. And some student was brave, or some prof was brave enough to ask and share their student's response, which I thought was priceless. And this one student said, if I can do my laundry while class is going on, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to watch the video at 2.5 times speed later. But if there's something happening in that class, if I want to be there, I will be there, even if it's remotely. And that goes right back to that comment. If you can be replaced by a computer, you probably shouldn't be in the classroom. Oh, we got a couple in the back.
Okay, so I have a question that how does AI knows all the formulas for the maths and science? Because the formula changes as per the situations. So how does AI knows that in which situation you have to put which formula to get the answer?
Well, and I think that comes back to the teacher. When we're teaching something and we show the students a process, we might show them 1 or 2 different ways to do it. Generative AI has access to thousands, if not millions, of different ways of solving that kind of problem. And so if we're able to, it's able to go out and search very quickly, whereas I might struggle in class to come up with a 5th different way to solve this kind of problem. So I think that to me is the difference between what I can do. But what it can't do that I can is see that look in my students' eyes that you're not getting this, are you? And I would never point to anybody and say that, but I can sense that in a space that somebody's with me or they're not with me. And to me, that comes back to the teacher. That superpower slide I had, that's probably the key to all of this, is being that person that cares and engages and demonstrates the value.
Yeah, there's one last online question, if you don't mind. From Pam said, I really like what you said about building trust with students. So how do we reframe cheating to allow for use of these tools?
So my personal approach is to talk to my students about AI in the very first day and say, I know it's out there. I know how it works. I know what it does. I know what it can do for you. And I know what it can do to impede your learning. Let's talk about it. So, and I talk about how would you think you could use AI in this class? And then, well, why do you think that would be helpful? And how might that impact your learning? How might that stop you from actually learning this? And I take 15, 20 minutes. I have them work in groups to come up with some of these, to talk about it themselves. They bring it back and I answer the questions. And I say, I use this all the time myself, but I use it responsibly. And in order for you, and again, this comes back to the value piece. If in my case, you want to be an engineer, you need to learn how to code. You need to learn math. You need to learn these things because all of these pieces come together into what we do every day. And you can't be pulling your phone out and going to some app to say, oh, how do I do this? We all have lapses in memory. We all have those times when, oh, I can't remember how to do this. What do? We go to a book, we go to the internet, we go to something for that refresh, and that's okay. But we knew what we needed to know. It goes back to the Rumsfeld at the very beginning. How do we get our students to the point where they know what they need to know?